got some nice coffee here. Hello? I don't know what to say.
It's my bad.
The weather is stunning, sunny. I think we're on the cusp of spring.
Yeah, it's nice outside.
It's beautiful. And we've got great company. This is my friend Abe, and he is also an author. So,
Well, haven't released anything.
well, you're writing.
Working on it.
Yes, but you're quite talented. So,
Haven't read it, so I don't know if you can say that.
okay. All right.
It's fun though. It's fun.
Stop being humble.
That's just the truth.
All right.
It's my bad.
Why don't you introduce yourself to the lovely folks of my channel?
Yeah, my name's Abraham. I'm a friend of Roman's here. We definitely first connected with books, just talking about books. Both loved reading fantasy, different kinds of fantasy, dipping into sci-fi, and yeah, it was fun talking books with him, and we connected over that, and we've just been friends for a while now. So he invited me here to talk with you guys about why I think it's important to read fantasy and why he thinks it's important for people to read fantasy.
Exactly, and that is what we are talking about. This video topic is just the simple question, why read fantasy?
So I've done a couple research papers on this. I actually did my senior project similar to this in high school. And one of the most compelling reasons I found for why people should read fantasy, especially adults, just because there seems to be a stigmatism that's definitely lessened recently over the years, but that adults shouldn't read fantasy because it's childish. It's fairy stories. It's stuff that's not real. Once you're an adult, you know it's not real. Therefore, what's the value in it? And one of the most compelling arguments I heard was J.R.R. Tolkien. He had an essay called On Fairy Stories, and he has this idea called the suspension of belief. And he outlines it, and it's basically saying that when you're reading a fantasy book, your mind is kind of already in a malleable state because you're reading about all these things like magic or dragons or any fantastical element in any fantasy book that puts your mind outside of its normal comfort zone as it is. And because of this, fantasy books are uniquely suited to present new ideas, new philosophies, just challenging beliefs that you wouldn't normally otherwise be open to, since your mind is suspended, hence the name, the suspension of belief. And he and C.S. Lewis portray this very well, I think, with Christianity. And that's just one. I think religion's a pretty common thing people try to work into fantasy books. But it doesn't have to be religion. It can be philosophy, any thought that you would not normally be open to. You are more open to it, perhaps, in a fantasy book, according to Tolkien, because of this suspension of belief. So
I love reading fantasy for that aspect, to be immersed. I don't necessarily want to be divorced from reality. I don't want to be like that. I don't want to escape, but there is that yearning for kind of escapism with fantasy. I do want to be immersed when I read my books, whether it be sci-fi, fantasy, or just, a fiction book. But mainly with fantasy, there is a level of immersion that I no other genre can really deliver on. And when you're talking about fairies, dragons, it's just, you're like, wow, what do we got here?
Yeah.
So I can't help but get lost in that kind of story.
No, it's amazing. And I think that word escapism is probably one of the first things we should address, because that's, I feel like, the biggest thing people have against fantasy is they say, oh, you're just using it to escape. Escapism is the common phrase. People are like, oh, like, I don't read fantasy because it's just a way to escape. But I think what people misunderstand with escapism is that it's less of a running from something. Because when you're escaping, you're escaping something, but you're escaping to something else also. And this is something that Tolkien also talks about on fairy stories. And I read a couple research papers done on escapism specifically, and multiple authors, I don't have their names, but they talk about how when people are reading fantasy, they're not trying to run away from reality because reality is too hard to comprehend. It's not like, oh, my life is so bad, I need to be in a different world. It's, okay, like, I love this world. There's so many great things about it. And at the same time, I need a break. Let's go to this magical world where nothing is impossible, where like sky's the limit. There's all these new fantastical elements that I can escape to and enjoy. And then that brings up another one of Tolkien's main advantages of fantasy, which is recovery. Escaping to these other worlds allows you to recover from the stress of your 9-to-5 job, or any number of things. So
what got you into fantasy? When did you start reading fantasy?
So when I was a kid, my older brother read Magic Treehouse. That was like his introduction to reading. Because my parents are big readers. We have like a small library at home, and they've just always encouraged us, like, read. Don't just be on screens. There's definitely benefit from screens, but you should be also reading. It's becoming a lost art. And so they introduced him to Magic Treehouse, and I liked Magic Treehouse. It wasn't my favorite. And then I found basically the same series, but in a more fantasy setting, I would say, called The Secrets of Droon. Same kind of thing, really, really thin books, like 50 to 100 pages. And there's like 50 of them or something. And yeah, again, it was like Magic Treehouse. It was just these small, like 6-chapter stories about these kids who get transported to this other world. And that just started it for me. That's always been my favorite kind of fantasy book. And I think it's directly correlated to that, where it's kids from Earth who get transported to another world. And I think, like people have blamed escapism, when I was a kid, that was definitely part of it. It was like, oh, like something's not going right in my life. Like, what would it be like if I could go to one of these other worlds? And then as I grew up and I continued to read, and I started reading harder fantasy books and just more expansive fantasy books, I was realizing, okay, obviously I know that these other worlds aren't real. They don't exist. But while I'm reading these books, it's amazing to just like live in one of these worlds. I've gone so far as to not finish a series before, because if you don't read the last book, you're still in that world whenever you go back to it. Once you read the last book, it's kind of like okay, like it's done. You know how it ends. If you don't read the last book, that world lives on, and that's magical.
That's a YouTube topic. That's a booktube topic right there, with just like, hey, don't read the last book of a series, because then you're in it forever.
Maybe that's an insult to the author, because
Maybe
I didn't
that
feel
is.
like I had to read
That's
the last
horrible.
book, but
You're a horrible person.
yeah, that's my bad.
No, I like that. It's a very interesting take. I grew up not really a big reader. I think Hank the Coward Dog or something. You know that detective dog? The cowboy dog? Something like that. Magic Treehouse. Magic School Bus. Like, there's just all sorts of children books. But I wasn't a big reader. I didn't really care for fantasy as much. And then 2020, my girlfriend's mom at the time, now my mother-in-law, she and I were like, okay, let's try this. Let's try the Fellowship of the Ring. I think we each got about halfway through, and we couldn't do it. It was a lot of work. It was a writing style that was it was very dense, very academic. And then I was introduced to Harry Potter, which was very digestible, and it just kind of brought me back to feeling like a child. Not introduced to Harry Potter. I knew of Harry Potter.
Yeah.
I read the first 2 books, and then I got on the 3rd book. And then halfway through the 3rd book, I started, I was gifted Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. And that book right there for fantasy just changed my world. This can be fantasy. Like, it doesn't have to be dragons. It doesn't have to be saving the world. It doesn't have to be about a hero. It can very well be about just a boy trying to get by. And it's just very intimate and emotional. It's great. And it shaped my tastes for fantasy. What is the number one aspect of why you read fantasy? Is it the world?
I think so. I probably have to think on that more, but I see that reflected in my own writing, where I've by far spent the most time so far world building as opposed to actually writing my book. And I've done, character outlines, and I've plotted out the whole thing, and I've sketched the characters, but more time by far has gone into world building, and I think that that's always intrigued me the most.
I actually think that is not being a writer, but I have played Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
I've built worlds, so I love world building. I think that is such a vital aspect in a story, and in writing. I think I appreciate fantasy books more when the world does feel fleshed out, fully realized, but also when the world is not, when it's fleshed out but not the center of attention. When it's clear the author's taken the time to build the whole world. I love that. But also not neglect characters, character development. Because if the characters aren't well written and multidimensional, then I'm not going to care about the world. But it's not the main reason for me. It's not the main reason I read fantasy.
Yeah, what is the main reason you read fantasy?
I don't know.
It's fair.
Wow. There is so much fantasy out there. So many different authors, so many different stories. And yeah, it may feel redundant. It may feel like copycat, copy and paste here and there.
Yeah.
But really, fantasy is just this one genre with so many subgenres, and just all these different types of stories. Sure, you've got the mainstays of dragons and magic and wizards and whatnot, but it's almost like a piano piece, just the instrument of piano, and how you can bring in different artists to play a different piano piece every time. The same keys,
Yeah.
but in different arrangements. And I just think that is fascinating to me. Seeing an author spin a tale in their own way, within the confines of fantasy. And I just love that. For me, I love fantasy stories that are more human and character focused, and less focus on magic and this and that. Like, it's okay for the wizard to just know magic. I don't need detailed spreadsheets of spells and magic systems. This isn't Dungeons and Dragons.
I agree, and I think there's definite advantages being like an author and a reader, because I like what you said, where the book should be focused on the characters. It should be character driven. I don't think everyone's going to agree with that. I've read quite a few writing books, and they all seem to agree with that, mostly except for Aristotle, who is his own weird guy. But yeah, like the book should be character driven. I think that's something I had to realize, but something I've come to enjoy, is that all of this world building I've done for my book, probably 90% of that's just going to be for me. And maybe a couple friends who are interested.
Yeah.
I don't think everyone gets to be like Tolkien and release the Silmarillion and have all their notes taken on by their son and released after their death with the full world flushed out. But 90% of the world building I've done, that's for me to immerse myself in the world. Like you said, it's not going to be the main focus of the story. It's going to be focused on the characters. And the 10% that does come out, that's just going to hopefully, if I do my job as a writer, just come out throughout the course of the book. But I've written like pages of history of my world with timelines and dates working up to when the book starts.
Yeah.
That's never getting released.
That's great.
That's just for me. And I don't think that makes it any less valuable, because I loved writing that. I love coming up with that. I enjoy reading it again. I think of the Tao Te Ching. We had to read that. I'm definitely butchering that pronunciation, but we had to read that in high school.
Okay.
And I don't think that
Don't even know.
it's I'm going to mess this up, so I'm not going to. It's a philosophy on how to live life.
Okay.
It's normally shortened to just the Tao, and it's kind of just like go with the flow, let things be. It's going to be what it's going to be, I think. I could be wrong on that. We read a lot of philosophy, but I don't think that everyone, including people who are readers, can just sit down and read that from a thinker, just his thoughts on how to live life.
Yep.
I think that more people can sit down, and when they're immersed in a fantasy book, and the main character is off recovering from a near-death experience with the Dark Lord, whoever that is, and they're up in a temple among the mountains, and they're learning from this ancient warrior monk about how they should live life so that they can get to the end and defeat whoever the main bad guy is. I think that in that moment, they will be able to understand the Tao Te Ching more than if they're just reading the book.
Yeah.
And I think that that's, again, one of the main advantages is that it allows a wider audience to receive information that they wouldn't otherwise get from just having to
I
read philosophy
agree.
books.
And that's why I always say I feel like fantasy books, I feel like we're able to learn more life lessons.
I think the main power is really in story.
Yeah.
As I've mentioned before, I think that fantasy is uniquely suited just because of the suspension of belief that Tolkien brings up. But story in and of itself is just a very powerful tool. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who doesn't watch TV or read books or play games or listen to audiobooks, because all of those things incorporate story. And you brought up fiction too. And I mean, fiction is stories that, okay, I don't know the definition again, but that aren't real. They didn't actually happen. Fantasy is also stories that aren't real. They didn't actually happen. It adds other elements, but I think the vast majority of people have enjoyed either watching or reading fiction, if not fantasy. And that's a similar thing. It's using something that didn't happen to present real ideas
Yes.
about life, and it speaks to the reader, allows them to get self-inflection.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, story's the main tool. Fantasy is a way to use the tool, I would say.
Yeah. Certain people don't want to approach the reality of certain situations or information with nonfiction or, this or that. So seeing those elements told in a fantasy tale is a lot more digestible and approachable and enticing. In your opinion, what do you think, in your long career of reading and writing, what is a good few books or series would you recommend for people to kind of get into fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're just starting off, you can't go wrong with Harry Potter. And I think
I agree.
if you're an adult and if you're a parent, I think it's even better because this is something you can read with your kids. If you're less into dragons and magic and you're more into just a captivating story, maybe more historically inspired, I would really suggest The Ranger's Apprentice or Brother Band.
Okay.
Those are more like, you got Scandinavian Vikings and you have English foot soldiers and these rangers that can blend into the background and really good with archery, and it's a good story. It's got good fight scenes. That's what drew me as a young boy. I want good fight scenes in there.
I don't think you should dive into Lord of the Rings.
I agree.
I don't think you should dive into Wheel of Time. I think those digestible entry points that you mentioned, I think, are good. What do you think of The Hobbit?
I think The Hobbit's great. I would say The Hobbit's similar to Harry Potter.
I think
that's a good
I think
one.
The Hobbit is a good,
Yeah.
just classic fantasy. It's got everything.
Especially if you want to read Lord of the Rings. Maybe you've seen the movies, you like the movies, you want to read the book. I mean, The Hobbit is the precursor, even though it came after, for Lord of the Rings. So it's a great entry point. You get to see Tolkien's writing style, his world building, but just on a more manageable level.
What about Sanderson?
I enjoy Sanderson. I know there's some mixed views on Sanderson just from people I've talked to. But I think that brings up a good point of just good versus bad. And these are big words that people kind of throw around pretty carelessly in anything: music, movies, books, food. And I think that people have just kind of started to mix up opinion with fact when they use the words good and bad. Because I don't think you can argue, in my opinion, that Sanderson is a good or bad author to someone else. For me, I've enjoyed some of his books. I think that they're good books, and I got stuff from them. Just because someone else doesn't enjoy them doesn't make him a bad author.
Yep. It goes with anything, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that goes with all books. And again, it extends beyond books, but I think a lot of times we get caught up too much in popular opinion on, okay, oh, this is good, and it's different when you're taking suggestions. You're like, okay, I trust this guy. I've liked a lot of the things he's recommended. Let me read it. But if there's someone who just is an influencer and they say, ooh, this was a bad book, don't not read it just because they said that. If you read the back of the book and it sounds interesting, why not give it a try? So I think you should just make your own judgments on all these things. I've read a lot of books that people think are bad, but I enjoyed them. So I don't really care what other people think about those series. Some names come to mind. And yeah,
Do you think Sanderson is a good entry point to fantasy
I think
for others?
with how much new generations are playing video games, I think that that's been like an essential part of growing up for a lot of kids now. I think that Sanderson could be a good entry point. It's not, his world building's pretty complex. His writing style's not super hard. It's not going to be like trying to read Tolkien. You're not going to have all these big words and complex sentence structures. And I think some of his books have a video game like feel to them, and so I think that that could maybe draw people in who are used to video games into reading fantasy. And he has some good stories. He has some good characters. He has some amazing world building. He dives a lot more into like politics and economy, which I enjoy.
That's a good point with video games and getting video gamers, getting gamers into reading. There's so many live streams, so many gaming streamers out there. It's mainstream.
Yeah.
It's a big thing. People get paid doing that. And I think Sanderson, like you said, I don't have a lot of experience with Sanderson. I've read 4 of his books, 3 of which were the back end of Wheel of Time. So, I only have read 1 of his books, and it wasn't my favorite. It was one of his first books. I think his second or his very first.
Mistborn?
I don't know. It was Mistborn.
Yeah, it's definitely early on. I don't know where exactly.
Very video gamey. It reminded me of Dishonored. I don't know if you've played Dishonored. It's
I've not.
you're kind of a thief, assassin kind of guy. Magic system is very similar, but the funny thing is Mistborn came out before Dishonored. So you would think Sanderson took from Dishonored, but no. But anyways, that's beside the point. That Sanderson is very cinematic with his writing style. He does a lot of cutting, cross-cutting. Like in cinema, when you have, let's say you have a battle scene, you're cross-cutting from perspective to perspective. And that can be very exciting. It picks up the pace. It's a clever tool to keep the interest going, keep the reader on their toes, on the edge of their seat, offer different perspectives within one sequence of events. And I've heard that Sanderson does that a lot in his books. I've seen it in the back end of Wheel of Time. There is a chapter that is the size of a Harry Potter book, and it's got 19 different perspectives, and it cuts back and forth. And Sanderson does a really good job with that. And I do think with that kind of style and flair that he brings, that could be a really good gateway for anyone.
Yeah, and I think for some people that's what they need
And
to get hooked.
If it gets them into reading, I'm all for it.
Yeah.
Honestly. What is one of your favorite fantasy books of all time? Or a few?
One of my favorites of all time.
One fantasy book.
One fantasy book.
One. How about like your Desert Island fantasy book?
We talking about like length? Because like if I might just pick a thicker book at that point.
Oh, dang it.
I'm sorry. I'm too logical.
You are. Stop.
One fantasy book that I have to read for the rest of my life.
We could go that route, or we could just, what's a fantasy book that you just think about almost every week that you've read in the past?
Can I say series just because I'm more of a series reader?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, I think in fantasy there's just a lot more series that I've read than standalones. But one series...
Are you looking at your bookshelf?
I am.
This is your bookshelf?
This is...
Let me take a look at this.
This is bookshelf 1 and then bookshelf 2.
Oh my god.
It's bad. I have a problem.
Hey, it's a good problem. What about this series? Weren't you talking...
Priory of the Orange Tree? I love the Priory of the Orange Tree. I'm not a fan of the ending.
Oh, okay.
Great book. So many moments throughout where I'm just like... I just stopped. I read a one-sentence And I'm just like, wow, that's deep. That made me think.
See, that's name of the win for me. I just think of just one sentence. I could just sit on that for a couple days.
Yeah. I think one Realm Beyond. And then book 2 gets crazy. You find out in book 2 there's
Okay,
like...
well, let's not spoil anything.
I don't think anyone's ever read this series before.
Well, there may...
Someone has. Someone
on.
has. That's my bad. It takes a whole different
But you
turn.
love it.
And I love it. And I don't know why. I've only read it like 2 times.
Well, that's more than I've read.
For a book that I really love, that's not a lie. I'm a big fan of rereading.
Your favorite fantasy series of all time would be... Because I've heard now just a bevy, like it just keeps changing. So I need to get your answer. So my favorite fantasy series right now is Wheel of Time. My favorite book of all time is Name of the Wind. You need to pick a series and then a favorite book. And I need it locked in.
Okay.
So when it's locked in this video, that means it does not change.
It can never change for the rest of my life.
It can never change the rest of your life. All right. How about this?
Top 3 series. How about top 3? Okay, top 5 series. We'll max it out there.
I haven't even read 5 series that are in fantasy.
I've been reading since I was like 5.
I know.
I've read so many series.
I know.
It's hard to pick.
Yeah.
And that's not a brag. I just didn't have a childhood. Kind of all I did was read. So
that sounds like a great childhood.
It was something. I enjoyed it. I think the Beyonder series has to be there.
Okay.
I love so much of what he did.
Okay. And then favorite book?
Favorite book?
Not within that series, but just like favorite fantasy book.
Favorite fantasy book.
That you just keep thinking about. And if you can't answer that now, you can text it to me and I could just, while I'm editing this, I could just pop it on screen.
Just pop it in. A singular book.
Yeah.
Go back to it.
Okay, go back to your thing.
I don't know if anyone's read The Spook's Apprentice. It's
I've never heard of any of these.
It's an interesting series. It's again a very very more tailored to a younger audience.
Okay.
Really easy writing style, super cool world. It's about just fighting all sorts of dark beings. And there's a book in there called I Am Grimalkin. And I love that.
Is that why that's your gamer tag?
That's my gamer tag. She's this witch assassin.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Which is just sick. And that's just a good book. And then on the complete other side of the spectrum, and I'm going to get a lot of hate from this, but I don't really care. A Court of Mist and Fury. It's the second book in a Sarah J. Maas series. And the first thing people are going to think is, oh, that's smut. Yes, it is. I skip over the scenes. Not a fan of the smut. It's not why I read it. It's in there because clearly she has an audience for it. But I think a lot of people can't see past that, and they hate her for that. She's a talented author. Mm-hmm. And I think her world building in specifically the second book of A Court of Thorny Roses, called A Court of Mist and Fury, is really good. Yeah, I don't know.
We could
just talk about books forever. But
we could talk about... We'd just be here all night, all day.
It's not exactly what the video's about, though.
Yeah, have we veered off topic? I feel like... Because I wanted to stay...
Maybe a little bit.
But I think...
Yeah, I think, again, just back to fantasy, the main thing is... And this is something that's just good advice for life, too, is just don't care what other people think.
Yeah.
I carry around books all the time, and I get plenty of weird looks. I'm sure plenty of people are judging me, like, oh, this kid's reading right now. He's not on his phone. He's not, I don't know, hiking or doing anything. Or they see the book and like, oh, isn't that like a child's book? And I'm like, okay. So thank you for your opinion. But if you enjoy a book, you should just read the book.
I agree. It doesn't matter. And I'm all about, if you're reading, that's awesome. And anything to get you reading. I've always said it all the time on my channel. Just, I would never want to look down on someone because they're reading a different genre or a particular subgenre or a type of author. Like, so what? You're reading.
And that's huge, because we've only talked about fantasy, really, but all reading's great. And I love reading classics, too. Mm-hmm. I love reading, like, Robin Hood and Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and Les Mis and just stuff that's not fantasy, but just good writing.
Yeah, yeah. And the more you read, the more you're able to develop your tastes and find out what you like and what you don't like, and just keep exploring different worlds and themes and characters and different situations and life lessons. it's an amazing time. And I think just most of all, fantasy just does it for me. And I know I talked about earlier this year how I'm like, okay, I'm going to get out of my comfort zone. I'm going to read different genres. I'm back into fantasy. Like it just, I can't help
And that's okay.
just, I crave that. I crave that level of just that otherworldly, world building and storytelling. And it's exciting.
People have been trying to get me to branch out from fantasy for a good 10 years now. And I've done it, and I enjoy it, but I always come back to fantasy.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Why read fantasy? Why do you think we should all read fantasy? In particular, why do you read fantasy if you do read it? And if you don't read it, why don't you read fantasy? All these questions, why do you love fantasy? And what is your favorite fantasy book? So yeah, let's talk about it in the comments, and thank you. Thank you for hanging out with me, having a cup of coffee, and talking about what we love, books, and specifically fantasy books. So thank you for hanging out and hearing us blab about fantasy books. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but thank you for seeing it all the way through. Cheers.